And we are recording. So, welcome everyone to another craft chat with Angelella Editorial. And for some reason, my video is not being brought attention to, so I'm going to be changing my settings on the fly here because I'm awesome. And yeah, so this week we are talking about uh, finishing up a novel, the novel ending, and figuring out how to craft our endings in our novels, which I feel like is a huge topic. So I don't want to spend too much time thinking about, other stuff. But before we do that, is it okay that we're here recording when Game of Thrones is on, which is also almost ending? Do we have any Game of Thrones fans here that I'm stealing your precious time away from you? Is this okay? Like, what's
Fine, because my husband is not a fan, so I have to wait till he goes up to bed to watch it anyway. So,
okay, that's fair. That's fair.
My husband's away too, so I'm just waiting on him to return home so we can watch it together. And he'll kill me if I watch it alone.
My wife is waiting for me to finish this so we can watch it together.
Yeah. So, can we talk about that for a second? Can you sell me on Game of Thrones? Because I've only ever watched about the first four episodes like three times, and it just doesn't hook me. So, what am I missing? What am I overlooking here? Because I want to love Game of Thrones.
You may not be missing anything. So it may not be your thing. I talk about this all the time with my students because half the class are super diehard Game of Thrones fans, and the other half could really care less about it.
Mm-hmm.
And the other half, the half that isn't into it, feels in this moment like they're missing something. For me, you said you've seen it 3 times. It took me 5 times to watch the first 3 to 5 episodes
Okay.
before I cared. But for me, I can put my finger on the fact that there was like too many places, too many characters. I didn't know what I was supposed to really care about or where this was all going or what was happening. And Kate, Angelella, another editor here, my wife, she was like locked in from episode 1. And so basically, you know how like when you read a fantasy novel, sometimes there's that giant map at the beginning that tells you where everything is. She was my map, and kind of explained it to me. But that was my way in. But that
Right.
I don't think that some people just aren't into it.
That's fair. Okay.
yeah, I tried to convince my husband, and we watched the first 2 episodes, and he was like, I mean, he's not a big fantasy fan, and I told him, well, there's only dragons occasionally. It's mostly a political intrigue, and I think you would like that. And he was like, eh. So I've given up on him, but I was pretty much hooked after the first episode. What I love about it for me is once you do get to know the characters, they take some amazing journeys, and so that's why I enjoy it. And that's why I'm really looking forward to this last season to see how some of these characters might coming full circle. And actually, if you are a fan and you watched the first episode, there were all these call outs to the first episode as far as the way they staged certain shots and had characters interacting and saying things to each other. It's been a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah. Suma, do you have any selling points?
Yeah, well, my selling point is, when I started watching, I don't remember if it was the first episode or the second episode, but they killed the wolf. And when that wolf died, I could not, we did not watch it for like 3 months or something like that, but we then slowly warmed up to it because, of course, you don't want to see an animal die. People can die how many ever times they want. But, but as we started watching it is when I realized that it's just very similar to some of these Indian epics that I've read growing up, like Mahabharata and Ramayana, and it's full of conflicts and manipulations and scheming twists and all these political drama with umpteen characters, and I was seriously drawn to that because of how each character had a separate journey. And I can see even in the, and once you get attached to these characters and you read the books, there are specific, each of these characters have specific chapters themselves, right? So um, those were very interesting to just learn from character development and stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah, cool.
Dragons. Yeah, dragons. Why not? We should watch them for dragons.
All right. Okay. So you all are all pretty much caught up, except for obviously tonight's episode, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. How are you feeling about the way that it's ending at this point? Do you feel like it's one of those things that could be a model example of how to end a story? And what do you feel like it's doing well? And you can kind of generalize it as we, kind of segue into the conversation about it. But what does Game of Thrones do really well, or is doing really well as far as wrapping up the story? Because I know a lot of people are talking about that this last week's episode did so many callbacks to the original, or you can even watch this as a standalone episode and really observe it and take it all in. And I didn't. But at the same time, I am really curious to know how the story is wrapping itself up.
Well, one thing they're doing really well is they are bringing together characters. So it's interesting. They redesigned the whole beginning credit sequence, which used to show a map of where this takes place, and it would be 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 different locations. And this season, it's essentially 2 that matter. And it's because they're bringing all these characters that have gone on these long journeys and endured all of this trauma and struggle, and they're bringing them back together. And I think that's why a lot of this last season is so highly anticipated, because you're seeing characters come together who haven't seen each other since the first season. And it's the ending of the first episode of this season. I was like, yeah. Oh, I didn't know I wanted to see those 2 characters interact, but when they did, I was like this. Bring on the next episode.
Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, for me, and we'll get to this with endings, but one of the things that I hit on with my students a lot is we want to establish an end point so that your audience has an idea roughly of if we're starting here, that our ending is going to be somewhere here. Like we can kind of feel it, see it, know where it might be. And if it's left or right of center, that's kind of irrelevant. Well, we've been waiting for winter to come. We've been waiting for the White Walkers to come.
The winter is here now.
The winter is here and the walkers are here. And so that alone, I think it's hard to say if it's going to be a successful end of the series now, I think, but in terms of where we should be, we're exactly where we should be. And the other thing I wanted to point out too, like one of the things I'm really digging is when a story is so good that in anticipation of more story, non-storytellers are communing online to theorize about what might happen. And that to me is like so incredible. Like people who don't watch fantasy, people who don't watch 60, 70 hours of television are watching this show, which is not like what you would expect a show for someone to tune in and watch. Right. And I think that's a testament to the story. And so that's been my like a fun thing for me, is to see like all the various theories and the conversations and arguments and the passion that people have for it is kind of exciting.
Yeah, I'm curious about what will win at the end, whether it's love or power, especially when it comes to Dany and John. But I don't even know if and who's going to be the king? Who's going to be the king of the North? What's your guess?
My guess is that no one survives.
No one survives. Everyone will die, because that's what they said in the beginning.
I think everything ends and a new something begins.
Yeah.
Whoa, that's deep.
Is it? It just seems like everyone's going to die.
Going to die.
I expect a high body count tonight. Very high body count tonight.
That's interesting. I don't know. Maybe I'll get around to it. We'll see. No promises, though. Especially because I'm not really big on fantasy, but whatever.
Neither am I. I'm not a fantasy guy. I'm not. And that's why I think you might dig it if you give it a little bit more.
I know.
That's why it took me so long, because I'm not a fantasy guy.
Right. And I think it's interesting because I'm not a fantasy guy, but my favorite thing in the world is Legend of Zelda. So, and that doesn't get more fantasy than that. So
Well,
it's like, why not? I feel like even the Game of Thrones theme song makes me think of Zelda, so I should just be watching it. But as far as endings are concerned, though, let's talk about what we think an ending really needs. Because I think, you know, what's interesting thinking about how people are coming together that are not storytellers and thinking about the story. I think that's really interesting to think about because they're picking up on things that, you know, maybe we aren't picking up on as writers, or that we sort of take for granted that are coming so secondhand or you know, so natural for us. But categorically, what are some of the points that you feel like we as editors try to urge writers to do in order to create and navigate good endings?
Well, I think at the very minimum, you need to address and have some kind of, I don't know if I even want to say closure, but hopefully your story has some kind of internal character arc that your main character is making.
Mm-hmm.
They have some kind of emotional need that maybe they didn't realize they were struggling towards at the beginning of their novel. Maybe they were working for an external goal. But I think all characters have some kind of internal need that they either need to satisfy, they need to address it somehow. They have to demonstrate growth and change. So even if they don't get everything they want or everything we need, that as a reader, we have confidence that, oh, this character has made a journey that is, it's satisfying because I feel like they've made progress, they've earned something, they've gained something. Maybe they've lost something. It depends on the kind of book you want to read. I mean, you can have a darker ending. So maybe they've lost something because that's justice. But I think you have to have some kind of closure centered on your main character and their emotional growth.
I completely agree. I would, I think, add to that. One thing that I find more so in new writers or in student work, although I see it in my own work sometimes, at least in early drafts, is that sometimes an ending will not be connected to the action that precedes it. That it's maybe an ending to a different idea you had of the book, or maybe you started with that ending and then in the process of writing it, it becomes a different book. So there's a really great short video online with the creators of South Park speaking to an NYU screenwriting class, and they basically talk about the words therefore, however, but because falling between your action, right? This happens, therefore this happens. However, this happens, therefore this happens. And so if your ending doesn't naturally come as a culmination, as a result of the preceding increased stakes and action, then you need to reevaluate it. And I know in my own work, that's really hard when you're that close to it. So I think especially with endings, it's really helpful to get another read, to get someone disconnected from it, emotionally disconnected from it in the process of writing it, just to kind of give some perspective, because that's a hard, just to kind of go, to talk what we've been talking about Game of Thrones, like my instinct, like my belief that everyone dies at the end of Game of Thrones, that's just kind of how my first drafts are. Like it's just maxed out at whatever the possible ending is. And that's not always going to be a good ending. That's often not a good ending. But that's because it's not connected to what I had written preceding.
Right.
Yeah, because Ross just mentioned Game of Thrones again. I'm going to say that, Cersei Lannister, one of the characters in Game of Thrones, she tries to warn Ned Stark right before he dies in the first Game of Thrones season. She says, "When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." So, so obviously, that pretty much I think that pretty much talks to what Ross said at the beginning about what's going to happen at the end of Game of Thrones, where everyone is going to die. But that said, on the contrary, Catherine Patterson, when she talked about children and young adult books, she said, writers have the responsibility of leaving readers, with a door that opens to hope. So, uh, so when we talk about endings in children's and young adult literature, we're talking about tying up any loose ends by answering any lingering questions about the plot, and also reorienting the characters towards the next phase of their lives. And that um, that I think pretty much summarizes what we need to do at the ending. It's a tough one to master, but if we completely switch up the story, and we can either take the reader by surprise, or just reveal something that that is new and it's satisfying, and uh, ultimately it's something that the reader believes in.
Yeah. I like the idea of concentrating on the hope element of it, because I think so many writers want there to be some huge disaster in the end and that just be the end. And I think when we think about the word the end, the term the end, we think that everything has to be neat and that everything has to be perfect, or everything has to be completely obliterated and dissolved. And it's whatever it is, it's absolute. But what I think ends up happening is that the end is more molding the entire conversation into, this finality that still demonstrates that there's still more, though we won't necessarily be reading more, but everything that we've done the previous, I don't know, 85% of the novel is all just kind of making its way towards this one big metaphorical lesson that exemplifies the whole thing about hope, as opposed to just being this random thing of events that's happening and, oh my gosh, it's so sensationalist and it's this crazy thing. But I think that's really, really interesting to think about. But as far as, thinking about bringing it full circle, because I know, we talked about that in the last craft chat, talking about, how to open your novel and those beginning pages and how to really hook your reader and all that other stuff. How do we teach people to connect the dots? Because when you are starting a new project, you may see the ending early on, you may not, or as you're writing and you're drafting, you're still holding on to that thing. But how can we show people how to actually connect those dots? What about the characters, or especially the main character, is related to the villain, for instance, right? So with our villain and the hero, their whole battle is based on something that the hero's done or the villain's done or whatever. But like, how are we able to say, hey, look, this is the one thing that's been going on all this time? How do we help bring that up throughout the novel? Because I think when you think about endings, it's not just about the last pages, because you're building up so much. Is there something that you guys feel like that you kind of teach people or show people or edit when you're editing, like how to do that? Because I think it's easy to say those things, that's what you have to do, but how do you do it? Because I think even I struggle with that sometimes. What are some tips or key points that you try to look for in your work?
Well, I think one thing you can always consider is, what's the promise you're making to the reader at the beginning of your book? I feel like in some genres, it's pretty much set in stone what your ending is going to be. So if you're writing a romance, you're going to have a happily ever after. And if you're writing a mystery, you're going to answer that mystery. You're not going to, usually, you're not going to leave it open-ended. There might not be justice, but you at least find out who done it. And so I think when you're just writing something that's maybe has more scope for a different kind of ending, what kind of book are you promising in the beginning? And think about the promise you're making to your reader in the beginning. So from those first chapters, you're telling something about the story you're going to tell. You're promising them, oh, this is going to be lighthearted and fun, or this is going to be a fantasy with epic scope and battles. And then I think your ending has to kind of fulfill that promise. And a good way to kind of tie that is to actually look at pieces in the text, whether it's imagery, whether it's a question you're actually having your characters pose that doesn't get answered till the end, whether it's an emotional need that you're showing that is finally being fulfilled. I think you really need to look at your beginning, and you need to seed those elements when you're writing your end. And I forget which writer it was. I'm sure there's many of them that say that as soon as they finish the first draft of the novel, they immediately go back and rewrite the first chapter, because you have to tie that first chapter, once you finish that first draft and you know what your novel's about, then you need to redo your first chapter and make sure that the first chapter also reflects what your novel's about.
Yeah, I feel like I always write my first chapter last. It just feels natural to just tie it all in. And I also like to make sure that, my first and last chapter or chapters have some sort of common denominator. So for instance, my first and last scene may take place in the same place, or it may, the book Night Circus, I forget the line, but it begins and ends with the same line, but it also has such different meaning. And I think that in itself is such a good way to think about the fact that your story is kind of a loop in a way. When we talk about full circle, like really think about that. Like, how do you bring something full circle? It's, it could be that one line or that one question. Do either Ross, Suma, do you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Diane said as well. I think that when I'm working with writers on story, one thing we examine, and you talked about it, is if you're unsure of your ending, let's take a look at where you started. Let's take a look at the first third of this thing, because oftentimes you have to know how many drafts we're in, because maybe the start of your book is actually 40-50 pages from where you think it is, but let's look there, because that sometimes is a clue to where we might end up, or to kind of visit. Thematically, I think of something like The Road. I guess you could look at the film too, because they're fairly close, right? That it's not necessarily cyclical in nature in terms of where we begin and end, but it is cyclical in nature in the pursuit of family, in the pursuit of a nucleus that's going to protect itself, and it changes, and there's a loss, but there's hope, and I think that's a really important thing to kind of revisit something that I was thinking about listening to you guys talk about, that is that you can watch something like Reservoir Dogs, and spoiler alert, everybody dies at the end of that. And so you watch something like that and you're like, okay, so what's the point? It was entertaining at best and interesting to think about, and structurally at best. And you don't really think about it beyond that. Whereas if you're investing time in a several 100-page novel and everyone dies, or if there's just this, sadness and doom and gloom, you're not leaving your audience with any kind of hope. It's sort of like an investment. Like, they're not getting anything to kind of hold on to. And I think that's, to kind of tie into my second point, that's something that's really important in terms of looking at their main character. Has your main character gone up against the antagonist or gone up against their circumstances? Have they really thrown everything that they have to accomplish the goal? Is there anything left at the tank? Or conversely, is this really something that we are revealing and showing and portraying in a way that they desperately need and want? Or do we need to actually to refocus, or to heighten or elevate the external goal or the internal desire? Because those kind of calibrations adjust your endpoint. And you can have a smaller ending with a bigger emotional payoff, or the opposite, a smaller emotional payoff and a bigger external ending. But all of that, I think, is preceded in those early parts of the novel when you're developing that main character's inner need, external objective.
I agree with what Diane and Ross said. I think the ending pretty much ties the end. The ending in a novel pretty much ties it back to the beginning. At the beginning, usually a writer establishes the character, their world, their particular desire or passion, and also a flaw that arises from the fashion, and then by the end, um, they have a goal, and the goal is mostly something that arises as a result of their flaw. And the ending can really bring the reader back to the opening scene or the first line and just provide an added depth. And in the perfect loop isn't really the easiest ending to write also, but it requires a lot of planning and also editing and rewriting both the ending as well as the beginning to make it as easy and natural and authentic instead of that being forced or artificial. So that's something to consider as well.
Yeah, I think that's all great points, and I think yeah, just pose the question about what does your main character hope for. Um, that's such a big thing to really think about because I think it's easy to craft this world where these characters exist, but necessarily don't have a direct influence or impact on that world changing and figuring out why that world exists, why the story exists in that world in the first place. Um, do you feel like though that maybe the main character's goals and or motivations change over the course of a novel? Do you feel like their internal goal remains the same, uh, or maybe even their either external or internal, but stay the same throughout the novel, or do they change? And if so, why do you feel like they need to change?
Well, I think they can change.
Yeah.
They don't have to.
Right.
I think it can be a satisfying ending. I think we talk about this, and I keep quoting the Rolling Stones. You can't always get what you want,
Right.
but sometimes you get what you need. And I
Yeah.
think that's always an option for your story to have. Your character doesn't necessarily get what they think they want, but they definitely get what they need. And I enjoy those kind of books.
Right.
Yeah, I think it depends on the book that you want to tell or the story that you want to tell. So in thinking about that, first of all, I know so many writers who start with a story, and that's largely where a lot of the early problems come in because they haven't really thought through the character. And so the character is navigating a world that was created first, and then the character was created. So a lot of times the conflicts that exist, it's just a stagnant flat line of action, consequence, pursuit. It's not really anything engaging. And I've referenced this in other talks, but there's a book that I read that really kind of blew me away, which is called Dodgers by Bill Beverly. And it's an adult literary novel, but with a teen protagonist, which much respect to anybody who can pull that off, because I didn't pull that off very well. But that is a great example of a character who on the external is on this one deadshot mission, both internally as an escape and externally as he has to commit this crime. And then the crime is committed about just over halfway. And then it changes and it becomes something totally different. It becomes survival. And then it changes again and it becomes about disappearing. And so you have this like huge, at the beginning, like this huge arc of like, oh yeah, I can see it. You see the end point. And it's an interesting authorial switch up to say, well, that's actually not the end point. I'm taking you somewhere you don't think you're going. And what ends up there is the book slows way down and becomes this like almost fantasy ending of not anything. It's completely devoid of anything you've seen up until that point, but it works because it's all connected. And so you can switch up in those respects, or you can have like a straightforward narrative where, there is this super goal and this inner need, and you can kind of draw the line. But I think it depends on what story you want to tell and how complicated or complex, not saying that's better or worse, but just more complicated you want to make it.
Right. Because I think it's that idea is interesting because breaking the rules, I think, is something that is really hard to do when it comes to crafting endings or thinking about them, because we do we're so used to, navigating a story a certain way. Do you remember, how well do you remember that book? Do you remember what actually happens to the character internally that changes that halfway point, or whenever the crime happens? Like, what's actually happening to them personally that, that forces that first change, and then like what's happening internally? Because I'm really curious about that.
So in that particular book, what ends up happening is he leaves in a group. Like, it's kind of like think of it like the Odyssey. I mean, that's kind of the most generic but most referential example I can give, right? It's a big group, and at the point that everything starts to change, he's by himself by the end of it. So having to no longer deal with the super egos or the insanity or the passive characters, and now he is the one that's in charge of himself. That clears the path for him to fall into situations he can fall into, or avoid situations more easily. So that, in that example, that's the big difference.
Interesting. Suma, any thoughts?
Yeah. So I agree with what Ross and Diane said. I do
Disagreements.
I no disagree. But yeah, I'm not disagreeing at all, because the one thing that I'd like to add is that is what Christopher Vogler says in The Writer's Journey. He says the hero crosses a threshold, and then they re-enter their known world as a changed person, and having grown much and learned even more. So I think a classic example of something like that would be stories with quests. So The Wizard of Oz, The Lord of the Rings. Some of these novels, they show that the return of the main character actually marks a celebration and a moment of great self-realization, or saving, of those that the hero has actually left behind at the beginning. Even I think another good example for that would be The Empire of the Sun. If you remember that movie, wasn't that Christian Bale in that movie?
Yes.
So if you look at the last scene in Empire of the Sun, where the camera just focuses on Christian's eyes, and that was enough to just show that it was the death of innocence, and he's a grown up man now. And it's a beautiful coming of age story. So those are moments that readers will hang on to, and I think we'll have to pay attention to how to make those moments memorable, and how to make that final sequence a very important part of this main protagonist's journey, and showcase how they have not only improved by their heart, but also they've improved the lives of those in their known world.
So, coming off of that, we talked a lot about the do's for an ending, but what about the don'ts? So, for instance, when I think of exposition, tends to come up in early drafts in endings, where there's just these massive info dumps, or it's really these long monologues that just talk about, this is what we learned, and I feel like that's just not fun to read, and I just rather just jump to the epilogue, or if that is whatever. So coming off of that, what are some things you see often in others' writing and your own writing that you try to say, hey, don't do that?
Well, I see stories where they stop before they get to the emotional end, that they think, oh, well, my main character has accomplished the journey, but it doesn't affect them emotionally. They haven't resolved. What I really want to know is, like, how does this affect the character? And so you can stop too early, and you can go on too long. I mean, I hate to say it, but the final Lord of the Rings movie, Return of the King, it goes on and on. And as much as I love it, and I'm a fan of the Lord of the Rings, and I loved the movie, just for someone who wasn't a fan of that story, it's like, oh, another ending. Oh, another ending. It was like a fade out, and then, oh, here we're ending up this character's story. And I feel like, one of the most, and I'm curious if anyone has seen this and would agree, that one of the most perfect television series endings I've ever seen was for 6 Feet Under, because what they did is they used a device, a narrative device that they used for every single episode, which was at every episode began with a client and showing how they died. And then this client would end up at the table at the funeral home. And that was tangential to everything that was going on with the family that owned the funeral home. And the ending of that series showed the deaths in a similar format for every main character. And it wasn't so much on, who did they end up married to and what were they doing and how did it just gave enough of a flavor to say, oh, I think they got past this problem, or I think they're going to make it, or I think they found happiness. And that's one of the most perfect hours of television I've ever seen.
Full disclosure, whenever I feel like I need to cry and I can't, I YouTube the ending to 6 Feet Under, because there's a Sia song that just takes me apart, and it plays the entire ending, and I'm just bawling, and my wife will walk in and be like, are you watching the ending of 6 Feet Under again? I'm like, yeah. But yeah, I totally agree. It's one of the best. I think for me, I should maybe have said this at the top. I'm the worst when it comes to endings. And I mean that from an editorial and from a writer standpoint. What I mean by that is I both have struggled as a writer with endings my whole career. And I love my endings when I settle on them, and they're usually wildly unpopular. Just go look at the reviews of my novel. People never know what's going on. How did it end? Was it real? Was it not real? And in my mind, it's usually fairly straightforward. So when I work with writers, I am all for, like, let's just see how crazy, wild, insane, less information, more information, just do whatever you want. And then we can dial it back, dial it up. Let's see, what if we did this? What if we did that? Because I think sometimes we can be really a little too precious with endings. So for me, the things that I'm like, don't do that is, don't introduce a brand new character at the end that's going to have some kind of impact on everything. We don't give a shit about that character. We don't know who that character is. So why would you? And I'm guilty of that. Like, let's not just add 2 detectives at the end who are going to have some impact on the story, or let's not add a character who has knowledge of everything that we've just spent 400 pages, 300 pages knowing. That you're going to show up and have that knowledge. And the only other thing that I think for me can get in the way is if characters begin to do a little too much precious reflecting or pondering or preaching on everything they've just come through. I like to think of it like a boxing match. Like, and going back to what Suma said with Vogler, like, when your character crosses back, like, they should be either physically, psychically, emotionally scarred, bruised, battered, beaten. They should have come through hell and come back now a changed individual in some way, either visibly or not. Like someone who suffers with PTSD, you can't see it. You don't see those scars on that person, but they're changed. They're different. And therefore your ending will be different. But they also don't have the mental capacity or distance and space to then say, what I just came through was rather profound. We don't need that. That's not, it's about, let the reader be more participant in this. You can guide the story, but don't start to pull that for me takes me out of the story.
All right.
Yeah.
And I just want to add one thing, because now thinking about, the TV series ending that I loved the most, the one that I hated the most, because it completely contradicted everything about what the story had been before, is the ending to How I Met Your Mother.
Don't get me started.
Oh, don't get me started. So
that whole last season didn't need to exist. But
yeah.
Whatever.
I mean, what I don't want to see in an ending is, I don't want to see the character make a 180-degree turn from who they've shown us they are the whole time. Unless you set it up properly with a twist ending where you're seeding the clues, So don't have your character do a 180 just to fit the plot, and don't have I hate this the most in any kind of fantasy story, what I call magic ex machina, where all of a sudden, like Dorothy's slippers, all of a sudden, they could have taken you home this whole time. That's stupid. It's not set up. It's stupid. And the only reason people love that story is because the movie was cool. If you read the book, it's awful and it's racist. And no.
Yeah, I have read it and I totally agree.
Sorry.
It's not a good book.
Yeah, I struggle a lot with endings as well as beginnings, and I write them multiple times. I write multiple beginnings and multiple endings and let them sit a while. So that's what I would encourage readers, writers to do as well. Read through your entire manuscript from the beginning and see which flows best, and make the most cohesive, whichever beginning and ending makes the most cohesive sense of your story. Use that. I guess the other thing to consider is we did discuss that everything does come back to what happens in the beginning. But if you look at novels like Gone Girl, for example, by Gillian Flynn, the author pretty much pulls the rug out from underneath the readers, because we keep guessing what the ending is, and then we're completely surprised. So that's something to consider as well, to see where, what kind of a novel we are writing, and if we are going to be choosing our own adventure, then the novel endings are pretty much open to interpretation, and the reader must decide how to interpret those outcomes with fewer certainties.
Yeah, I actually am really good. I think I'm good at writing my endings. It's my beginnings that I suck at. And I don't really know why. I feel like I have this idea of how I want a story to end. I think I understand the hope and the questions that I want to, or how I want to answer the questions. I just never really know for sure how I want to start posing those questions. So yeah, that's all good. As far as I know we talked a little bit about, that magic ex machina and, the shoes and all that stuff. What do you feel like happens, other things like that happen in the story? So for instance, thinking about, the other co-stars in the novel, in the story. I think a lot of writers end up having your non-main characters resolve the story, where, the main character's allies may be the ones that have a heavy hand in figuring it out, and that's just bad. And I use this term loosely, but I feel like the final battle in your novel needs to be between, two characters. Do you feel like that's something you agree with? And if so, like, how do you navigate trying to get that one character to just confront their the big obstacle, whether that be the villain or whatever?
I think for me, I try and keep it simple. I try and keep it simple when talking about it. I feel like we're reading to watch a character who's taking action in pursuit of something, and I believe from those I've worked with that there's either hesitation because there's a not knowing how it's to end, or a hesitation in oftentimes a writer has become so emotionally wrapped up in their hero that maybe it's themselves and they're further protecting or unsure of putting their protagonist in further peril. But I feel like there needs to be the ultimate action taken in a final attempt to pursue, whether that's a confrontation, and it doesn't have to be a big thing. Like, even if it's just, I think about the ending. Ending to Dodgers is very kind of slow paced, conversational. Ending to A Few Good Men is a conversation, a heightened, dramatic one, but it's just talking, and it's a reveal of information. And so I think having those secondary characters, a part of it to the extent that they're connected to the story that's been designed is certainly, in my mind, I approach it logically. It has to make sense. But it's your hero's story. They're pursuing a thing. Do they give a shit about it? And if they do, they're going to go after it. And if they don't, then did they stop giving a shit somewhere along the way that I was unaware of? Mm. And I think it can be lost, and there's a lot of reasons for that, because maybe it's a couple hundred pages you've been writing, but let's face it, you've been working on it a long time. And so sometimes you lose threads, but I think that's where an editor can kind of come in and be all in on a protagonist. And then at the end, it's just not satisfying enough. Maybe they're not as present or as engaged or as focused, or it becomes a different ending. All of those things can vary. But so for me, I try and keep that through line simple, as like, it needs to be them that, to go back to what Suma says about Vogler, like they have to be the ones that cross back over the line, that take that action, that take that pursuit, that go for whatever metaphor you want to use to complete their journey.
Right.
And I think you need to consider what are you trying to say, and why did you choose this main character to say it? Okay, so maybe you're trying to say something, and I'm not saying that you have to have the moral of the story, but when you're telling a story, there's a point to it. And whether you're saying love conquers all, or you can find hope even in the darkest of times, you've chosen your main character for a reason. And your main character is going to show some kind of emotional growth, some kind of discovery. And so if they are not acting, how are they going to make that discovery? How are they going to change themselves? So I feel like if you're struggling with how to find what it is they need to do, you need to think about, what am I trying to say, and why did I choose this character to say it? And maybe examining that can help you figure out, okay, what is it that my character needs to do to express this thing that I'm trying to say?
Cool. Suma?
I would add that it's pretty much the end of the action phase of the novel, right? And so the protagonist pursued their goal in the face of a conflict, and they believed that the resolution was either a happy or a successful or a satisfying one. But then they were wrong, and the resolution turned out to be devastating. But here's the good news, right? Even though their hopes of achieving their goal didn't really seem as good as dead, it's time to turn things around. And that's when we actually reach that point where we write that last chapter, when we do that, when we plot that novel. So I feel like despite finding a victory that, the hero is usually often facing a great ordeal for receiving some sort of a prize, and they lose something. And the losing often comes in the form of receiving a magical object, if it's a fantasy, or reuniting with a long lost relation or something like that. So an example is, I think in Star Wars, was it Princess Leia is rescued, right? And then in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan returns to life. And in Harry Potter, Harry realizes that he is very much loved, and he has his friends now. So that is something that we'll have to really pay attention to find out what the hero finds how the hero finds themselves in uh, that last final moment, which Christopher Werglo says it's the truth. They discover the truth, or there's an ultimate rebirth of the hero. So what is the victory, or what is the metaphorical message that they learn about their sense of self, is something that we'll have to sprinkle into the ending.
One thing, just to add to all of this, that I will often ask writers to think about as they're writing, and then to not write it into their stories, but what's the one thing? Think of a singular word that is the want of your main character that is tattooed on their back. Like, what is the thing that they want beyond everything else? And then ask yourself in every scene, is it in pursuit of that or connected to that in some way, especially when you get to the end? So if your main character cares passionately about legacy, right? Legacy is tattooed on their back. That's what they care more about than anything. Does that ending, is it a satisfying culmination of that pursuit? Is it connected in some way, right? So like going back to the road, the family is tattooed on the back of the child, right? At the end, when his father dies, and the spoiler alert, father dies, and he's reconnected with a new family, the good people carrying the flames, does that connect? Is that something that they're in line with, or is it end and it's in dissonance with, which is also okay? That sometimes I think can be helpful to visualize and think about.
Yeah. Which it would really suck if they change their mind and then they're stuck with that.
And they're stuck with that tattoo. It's just the worst.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I think to kind of go back on what I was mentioning earlier about, you know, whether the character changes their minds about what it is that they want. I think what I think I really mean to say is that your character may not really know exactly how to articulate what it is that they want until they go through the ringer of the story. And then also not being able to identify that what it is that they do want looks a little bit different than what it is that they perceive in the beginning. And that may be a hard thing for them to grasp. I think it's almost like, I don't know, when I was a kid and then Christmas came and I didn't get the thing that I wanted, and I'd be upset and I'd throw a tantrum. Not that I was that kid, but just being anecdotal here. But when I had, what I did have was something that I realized I didn't need or wanted until later. And I'm like, I'm really grateful that I got this thing instead of that other thing. And I'm not going to throw any more tantrums at Christmas time. So it's just a matter of accepting the fact that you get what it is that you get and you make the most of it. And your hero needs to make the most of what it is that they have in the end, and that they have more than what they may realize. And they should count their blessings and stop being a wussy, because it'll be fine. But sometimes a book is not just one, but there may be 2 or 3 or dozens. So I wanted to touch on our final topic. How do you end a novel that is part of a series? What are some tips that you have off the bat?
Okay, so I went back and looked today. I looked at the endings of Hunger Games, the first one, and the second one. And you have to remember that publishing is a business. And if you are breaking in with your first novel, you cannot leave a cliffhanger. You're gonna piss off a lot of people, me included. So when I remember when the first Hunger Games book came out, there was a lot of buzz around it, and I read it. And when you get to the end of the first novel, essentially Katniss and Peeta have survived the Hunger Games. They're brought back to District 12. She's had to pretend that she's madly in love with him because she's afraid that if she doesn't, that the president will undermine her somehow. They arrive back in District 12, and she essentially tells Peeta, you know, I've been pretending, and I've done it to keep us safe. And that's where the novel ends. And it's wrapped up that whole initial storyline, which is what, you know, who's going to survive the Hunger Games and how far will Katniss go to survive and to protect her family. It leaves open just a little bit more. Oh, well, there is this potential danger that in the task that the whole of the first, she could still be in danger. So it left room. It answered one question, but it left open another. And I think for your first novel in a series, that's a great thing to do. Now, if you read the end of the second book, where they've had the quarter quell, and essentially it's ended by they've broken out of the games area, and she's been rescued, and she's reunited with Gale. District 12 has been destroyed, and Peeta is in the hands of the Capitol. Well, that's not resolved a lot of things. But by that point, if the first Hunger Games was a huge success, and by that point people are sold, I'm going to read that second book. So I think you have to remember that unless you are a Suzanne Collins, or unless you are J.K. Rowling, who did not really have a cliffhanger until book 6. You know, at the end of Half-Blood Prince, Dumbledore is gone, and Harry knows that he has to find Horcruxes. Okay, so but that essentially each book stands alone. It answers the main question of the plot. It opens up another question that leads to another one. I really think that's the best way to go. It's the most satisfying way to go. I get so angry. I'm to the point now where I almost won't read a book in a series unless the whole series has come out, because I do not want to be frustrated that way. And that's not a good thing if you're selling books. You do not want people to wait. You want people to buy all the first volume so that your publisher is like, oh yeah, we'd better take volumes 2 and 3 and 4 and 5.
Right.
I'm not the resident YA guy in any sense, but I totally agree. And in the instances I can think of in the genre side of things or on the adult side of things, your readers are coming for character more than story, and they want to see a full story. And even though I say that, if you end in a cliffhanger and there's no more story, now our character who we care about is in mid pursuit of something or mid peril of something. And I think it's such an I think readers can be or writers who are passionate readers to start, who read series that really light them up and make them want to write. I don't think sometimes they really examine how those books, the successful ones early on, are structured. And so often I work with writers who have stories, just as Diane's talking about, where the ends have these cliffhangers and the stories are unresolved. And I say, you don't have a complete story. And they say, no, but I'm saving it for book 2. I'm saving it. You're going to save the best fucking part for book 2? Like, put it in book 1. Let's have a full story. Let's destroy book 1. And then if you're lucky, you'll get book 2. Or if enough people read it, if you're self-publishing, and you have a readership, a foundation built in, book 2 will sell even more because word of mouth will build up. I think that you need to tell a full story. And again, because character is so important, now you're actually more free as a creator, as a storyteller, because now you can take those characters and put them in any situation. You can jump ahead in time. You can have it happen 5 minutes from the previous one or 20 years. We don't give a shit. We like those characters from book 1, so you can now tell whatever story you want if you want to do it that way. I mean, you can tell the more continuous stories that are certainly more popular now. But I think you have to tell a complete story. You can't have a partial story. That's not – a story has a beginning, middle, and end.
Yeah. So I would encourage the writers to think about what kind of story they're trying to tell. What kind of series are they going to write? Is it episodic series or is it a story arc series? So when I say episodic, I'm talking about a story where the main characters live through a series of unconnected plots which are only related to each other through those characters and the genre and the general nature of the stories. For example, I'm going to take some middle grade examples here. So mystery series by Dory Hilstead Butler. She writes the Haunted Library series or the King and Kayla series. The King and Kayla especially is about a lovable dog that helps his human girl solve a mystery in every single book. Now, those are, again, fascinating and they're really cool to read, but that's also, part of a series. And that's something that readers have to think about. They still have to tie up the loose ends, but then they really don't have to hook us with something about what's going to come in the next book. And there is really no character growth in terms of age or whatever, because it's just fun to read. And as far as the story arc is concerned, I completely agree with what Diane and Ross said. We typically follow certain guidelines. We tie up the loose ends for the current story's plot and then hook the reader with a little something for about the next installment, and then reorient them. And a classic example in the middle grade for that is Cleo Edison Oliver by Sunday Frazier. So there were 2 books that came out, I think, in the series. I don't know if there have been more, but I definitely remember 2. The first one is when the girl is an entrepreneur and she she wants to be she wants to be a businesswoman when she grows up. So she starts out with a business idea, and it's about a tooth pulling company, and it's really amazing and it's hilarious. And then in the second book, she learns a lot about business, and then she builds a brand new business again with her friend called Passion Clips. So that's another classic example in middle grade, especially middle grade contemporary, um, about books with uh, the story arc series.
I think a good way to think about it too, just as a screenwriter and TV writer, when you are pitching a TV show, right? They want to know what happens in season 1, but then they'll ask you, and what are the next 5 seasons? Meaning, we want a complete story in season 1. We want 6, 7, 8, 10 episodes and it be a complete, but we also want there to be enough left over to build upon it for future. And I think if you're thinking about writing a long form story, a series, and you can begin to think through building enough conflict early on that you can then build upon it and take it in different directions, but still tell that complete story in a single book.
Yeah. I like to think that when you are thinking about writing a series, the first book has to do a really good job of resolving its central conflict, but that being such a tiny part of the grand scheme of things. And what I mean by that is that when you look at something like the hero's journey and what that structure is and what that tells you, it tells you that, in the beginning, your character is very selfish or self-centered. They're really focused on what it is exactly that they want. But by the time that they get to the end of the story, they're more focused on, saving the world and whatever that may mean for the novel. I think a first novel will probably expand a little bit more on that whole selfishness thing before they're really thinking about saving the world. They may still resolve the conflict and everything will be good, but there's still something else that remains that says, hey, look, something bigger than us, than me, is happening around me. I don't quite see it yet, but it's there, and I'm going to have to go on another journey that is similar to this one, but is also still very different from the fact that, hey, we did this thing, cool, but we still have so much more to do, because that's also true to life. We resolve our daily conflicts, but there's still more days to be. So, and we don't really know what those next days are going to have or what they're going to hold or whatever and present, but there's still more things for us to do, but we're still going to be the same person going into the next day. But at the time, 10 years from now, 10 books from now, we'll still be very different people. So yeah, essentially, if you want to write a novel and you want to end it, just make sure you're posing the right questions, make sure that there's hope, and make sure that your character, your main character, is, the focus and the catalyst in your ending. Before we wrap it up, does anybody have any final thoughts or comments or anything to add to the conversation before we, call it a night and I can get you guys to Game of Thrones?
Nothing.
Cool. So
I hope you're sold on Game of Thrones, Kyle.
We'll see. I mean,
what is it? Like, what is holding?
I don't know.
You do know. You don't not know. You know. What is it?
From you, Game of Thrones?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What is it?
I don't know. I don't. It's the same thing with I don't know, the Marvel Extended Universe. I'm not a big superhero guy. I'm not a big fantasy guy. And it's interesting because that surprises a lot of people. But when they ask me what I do like, I really have a hard time explaining what that is because I feel like my likes are so sporadic and random. So I
feel like you're the target market for that Detective Pikachu movie I saw advertised.
Listen, you see the Pikachu in the background, right? Okay.
I did.
Yeah, so I think there's something to be said about being able to tell a story that has the ability to cross over and intrigue people and that wouldn't normally watch it, because in the same way that something like Pokemon Go was a huge phenomenon, people who didn't play it were into it. It's the same thing with something like Game of Thrones. I probably would not be into it, but there could be that one thing that does it. I think what I need to know is that who are the characters that I really feel attached to? Because I think whenever I do latch on to a show or a book or whatever, it's finding the right characters. And so far, I don't. In the first few episodes that I watched, I think I like the kids in Game of Thrones in the early going, but at the same time, I'm still not hooked quite yet. And maybe I just need to just watch a random episode later on in the season, in the series, just like see something that is enticing and make my way up towards that in the same way that I got into Doctor Who because I watched the what's that one episode with the
Blink? Was it Blink?
Yeah, I think it was. Yeah.
The Weeping Angels?
Yeah, the Weeping Angels. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that's what got me into Doctor Who, and that
I knew it.
watching the first few episodes, I'm like, this is okay. So I don't know. I just need to. One day it's going to happen, I guess. I don't know.
Or not, and it's okay.
Right, and that's the other thing
not.
too. It's okay. It's
It
okay.
is. But I just, again, I am the first person. Like my students will say, "Oh, you just have to watch 7 episodes and it'll get better." Like I'm not going to watch 7 hours of something that's terrible
7 hours
just to get good. Like but this is like one of those shows that give it a couple hours, give it a couple attempts, and if you're still not into it, it's not your thing. But the kids, it's all about the kids. So if you like the kids, the whole thing's about the kids.
Yeah. All right. We'll see. I'm gonna keep trying. I'm gonna keep trying. It's like also what Angel. I can't get into that show. And everybody's like, it's so good. And
Season 1's terrible.
It's so painfully bad, and
it gets better.
Yeah, I hate that phrase. It gets better. It should already be good.
I agree. Totally.
Don't give me half-baked entertainment. Keep it in the oven.
Well, with Angel, they were not to nerd out. We had this conversation already, but they were trying to make it like the adult Buffy, and it wasn't flying. So then they made it the Angel Buffy in LA, and it worked. So once they go back.
Okay. I think I just don't like Angel as a character. If it were Spike, then I would be all over that.
Spike is an angel. You got to give it another.
But I want it to be.
hours.
I want it to be the focus. I want Spike to be the focus. I want a Spike spinoff.
Don't we all?
I guess I don't get what I want, and there's my ending. So on that note, thank you everyone for joining us on the Aircraft Chat this week. You can follow us on Twitter at Angel Editors. You can also follow us on Instagram now, Angelella Editorial. We're also on Facebook as well, same name. You can also visit us at angelellaeditorial.com for all your editing needs. Thank you, Ross. Thank you, Suma. Thank you, Diane. I will put everyone's info in the description box. Please hit the subscribe button and the like button. Follow all these lovely people on Twitter. And thank you guys so much for joining in. And we will see you at the Word Nerd Chat, which is going to be first Monday of the month. Or if you're not watching this week, then it's probably not going to be that Monday. So that's really awkward. But thank you guys. Have a great night. Enjoy Game of Thrones. Maybe I will too. And we'll see you soon.
Yeah, just jump right in with the current episode. I'm sure that'll go really well.
It might happen. I'm feeling very frisky today.
Don't do it.
I need a Weeping Angels episode, so it'll be fine. But, yeah, thanks guys, and I'll see you soon.